or sorting device. Gives you evolution, that is, gives you change that's adaptive. In my space here, I'm used to writing in black words, so I need to get my scale back. Let's start with this little formula here. Any population of variable replicators coupled to any filter or sorting device yields evolution, yields progressive change that is adaptive. Notice that the word genes doesn't appear there, the word natural selection doesn't appear there. It's a formula that's more abstract than that. Let's start with a case of regular evolution out there in the world. The replicators in that case are DNA molecules. DNA is a relatively complex molecule. Everybody knows the double helix design. You peel that double helix apart, now you have a single helix on one hand. And that helix by itself can serve as a template for the opposite molecules to kind of one by one add themselves to it, just by simple chemical attractions and electrical attractions, and then create a double helix, and this other half also creates a double helix, and you have two double helixes. It has created a copy of itself. That's what replication means, to create a copy of yourself. In very, very simple animals like viruses or bacteria, that is basically all that happens. The DNA replicates itself, then it breaks the bacteria into two, the bacteria subdivides, and now you have two bacteria where you used to have only one bacterium. The bacterium has created a copy of itself. The bacteria has had offspring. In larger animals and plants, animals like ourselves, the process is way more complicated because it's not only DNA dividing itself, it's now all the complex processes that take a fertilized egg and transform it through foldings of layers of cells, migrations of cells that become bone, concentrations of cells that begin palpitating and eventually become a heart. All those complex processes that take a fertilized egg and make a fetus that we almost don't understand. Embryologists understand a few things, but is one of those frontiers of science that it is very, very obscure yet, and eventually creates a copy of you. Well, because we're now talking about sexual reproduction, creates a copy of the parents. Half the father, half of the mother. Nevertheless, that is also replication in a more complex way. So replication applies to any process that creates a copy of something else. From the simple replication of a molecule to the much more complex replication of an entire body. Variability refers to the fact that whether in the simple case or in the complex case, there needs to be differences. Because if there are no differences, if the population is exactly the same as it was in the previous generation, then there is nothing to evolve. Evolution is fueled by differences. Evolution is fueled by heterogeneities. Evolution is fueled by variation. If you don't have any variation, you don't have any evolution. Because there's nothing for the filter to filter out. The filter is just a sorting device. The filter is just a sieve. It allows certain replicators to pass, certain other replicators not to pass. Or certain replicators to pass with more copies of themselves, whereas others pass with only a few copies of themselves. And therefore the next generation has much more of this than of this. 2 generations, 3 generations later, these guys are almost gone, whereas these guys are now the dominant form. But if there was no variability, if there was no heterogeneity, there would not be anything for the filter to filter out. There would not be anything for it to bias in one direction or another. So as important as replicability is, variability is equally important. At the level of single molecules, variability is typically just copying mistakes, what is called mutations. You know, a certain molecule that should be here by mistake is another molecule that is there, so that produces variation. For us, as larger animals, the largest source of variation is sexual reproduction. When you reproduce sexually, you're basically taking half of the genes of the mother, half of the genes of the father, and then blending them together to create something entirely new. Particularly if the father and the mother are from two different ethnic groups or from two different countries, then the variation is even more so. You create a hybrid from two entirely different groups. The more variation, the faster evolution. In the public lecture on Thursday, I'm going to give examples of this applied to language. So you will see at that point that this can be applied to a whole variety of things. The word population is also important because evolution cannot occur with Adam and Eve. It's just too small a gene base to start with. Not to mention the fact that, when you have Adam and Eve and they have like 3 sons or 2 sons, I don't remember how many they had. Well, who did they marry, the sons, really? I mean, if they were the only 2, unless they marry each other, and I think one of them killed the other, so there was only really 1, how did they manage to continue to reproduce? Where did they get women? Well, it's because, you're going to say, well, it's just a fairy tale that's in the Bible. Yes, I understand it's just a fairy tale, but it doesn't make any sense. Any evolutionary process needs a community, a reproductive community. It doesn't happen in couples. It happens in multiplicities. It happens in collectivities. It happens in bunches. You always need to think with populations. Populations of molecules, populations of bacteria, populations of insects, populations of animals, populations of plants, populations of humans, in which the variation is distributed in a certain way. That is already a different way of thinking with populations. When we, for instance, kill, when you read in the newspaper, well, this particular species of seal, or this particular species of polar bear, or this particular species of tiger has gone extinct. In other words, the species itself died. We don't mean to say that humans hunted every single tiger until they got the very last one. There goes the very last one, get him! And then you go get the last one. Okay, now you're extinct. Officially extinct. We don't have to do that. All we have to do is destroy their habitats or upset their habitats enough that the reproductive community becomes too small. And once it becomes too small, one becomes smaller than the minimum size. The minimum size is called the nucleation threshold. That's a big word that I'm not even going to write down in the thing because it's kind of pretentious, but that's what it's called. There's a minimum size, and it varies whether you're talking about mosquitoes or whether you're talking about zebras. Some of them have to have a larger minimum size, or the ones that have a smaller minimum size. But in either case, a minimum size for a reproductive community below which it begins withering away, and past which it acquires stability, and it can now pass its genes from one generation to the next in a more or less stable way. So the word population here is telling us always think in terms of reproductive communities, not in terms of Adam and Eve, not in terms of a single couple that started the whole thing, because that is impossible. The second line here tells us that there has to be something biasing those replicators in one direction or another. That is choosing the replicators for how well adapted they are to their environment. Since environments change, a volcano may have exploded and destroyed an entire forest, or an earthquake may have occurred, making all these rocks fall down and destroy an entire habitat or an entire ecosystem, or water may rise, and what used to be coastal plains now are inundated by water. Since the environment changes, from all that variability in the animal's genes, there's always some that you can pick